Thank you very much, and I'm very honored to be here and have this opportunity to speak to you. And my good friend Ed Martin asked me to come and speak this afternoon, and I could have guessed what the topic was going to be about or what he was interested in me talking about. I thought, well, there's so much to talk about. I don't know, where to begin, but I wanted to make sure that I leave plenty of opportunity for questions, because a lot of people have their own perceptions, their own beliefs about what happened, some misconceptions. I titled this Ferguson Facts, Fake News, and the Federal Government because I thought for a group of liberty-loving people like people who would attend the Eagle Forum, we would be interested in how those things affected what went on in Ferguson. But how many of you are from the St. Louis area? I just want to know. So some of you are familiar with Ferguson. I wanted to make sure I asked that question first because a lot of people don't know much about Ferguson outside of what you saw on CNN. It's an old community, not far from here. It's an inner ring suburb, so it's one of the earliest suburbs here of St. Louis County. Some of the oldest part of the community was in the 1850s. So you have really big beautiful Victorian homes, but then you also have a lot of post-war kind of suburban neighborhoods that you saw in the 1950s, kind of suburban sprawl. When the 1990s, by the time the 1990s came about, you see huge shifts in our demographics. The Ferguson was very much a white community for a long time. But from 1970 to 2010, there was a huge migration of African Americans from North St. Louis City to North St. Louis County, and that affected really all the communities surrounding us, not just Ferguson. Ferguson was very proactive in how we addressed the migration of African Americans into Ferguson, and we actually hosted a conference at the Florissant Valley Community College in the 90s called the Oak Park Exchange, and that was actually an attempt to try and educate people and bring people together to talk about commonalities among people and communities instead of being fearful and running away from what you see as just obvious differences of skin color that is part of the changing community. The reality is the skin color may be different, but home ownership and people who live in communities, people who want safe communities, have a lot more in common than they have that are not in common, I should say. So throughout that time, and the time that I grew up in Ferguson, I grew up, born in 1979. When I went to high school, McClure High School, and graduated, I was a student body president of a predominantly African-American school. Very young people, very accepting of, the differences, integrated. That community changed, as you can see, to be about 67% African-American where we are today. But a lot of the surrounding communities of Ferguson are 80 to 90% African-American. We oftentimes, over the years, have credited that, going back to the Oak Park Exchange, about how we work together to try and successfully integrate our community. So when the 2000s came along, if anybody's familiar with North St. Louis County, North St. Louis County communities oftentimes started to decline. Our community, however, we really did stabilize. We labeled ourselves a community of choice. We redeveloped our historic Main Street. We started electing our first African-American council members, of course, still not to the level that would have been representative of the entirety of the population. But keep in mind, in 125 years, up until August 2014, over a course of 125 years, only 3 African-Americans ran for city council, and 2 of them won. So it wasn't for lack of trying or attempting to. It was, who wants this job? By the way, I make $300 a month before Uncle Sam takes most of it to be mayor of Ferguson. And who would have done that? And ran for re-election in April. We had a really large influx of small entrepreneurs. We really put to work on trying to attract small businesses into the community, work with small businesses. We have a lot of great African-American entrepreneurs. The real conservative, free market, business spirit has really helped lift Ferguson over the years. We had a lot of capital investment in our community, built a new firehouse, community center, and police department, things that you did not see anywhere in North St. Louis County, especially those areas south of Highway 270. Even the Washington Post came out and said that we were the most diverse and integrated community by census tract in all of St. Louis. That should account for something, you would think. But unfortunately, on August 9th of 2014, it didn't take much before social media helps spread information all around the world. And I always throw this out there because I think it's important for people to kind of put this in perspective. The city manager called me at 1 o'clock. I was helping close up the Ferguson Farmers Market, who's been voted the best farmers market in the state several years over the past 20 years, and told me about the shooting. Didn't have much information. He was on his way back in town. I had even less information because I was getting it from him. But by 6 o'clock that evening, social media had spread the story, a false narrative and false story, all across the country. And at 6 p.m. that evening, I got a call from the Bay Area, because it said it on my phone, when I picked up at home, and it was a young lady telling me that I need to make sure I hold this murderous cop accountable for assassinating this young man in the streets of Ferguson. I was surprised because she seemed to know more information than I did at that point. These are the things that I read on social media while I'm trying to learn from our people what happened that day. I heard that he had his hands up, that he was shot in the back, that he was executed, that he attempted to surrender, the officer stood over him and shot him, that he was done execution style, on his knees. These are all phrases, by the way, I've taken out of media reports, not just social media, but I'm talking about the likes of CNN, MSNBC, and people like that, who reported this around the world. We also, of course, heard about militarized police responses against peaceful protesters, and that, of course, enraged the sensibilities of many. These are the kinds of peaceful protesters that I got to personally experience just a couple blocks from my house as they burned down the QT that was the place where I used to go and get big 44-ounce quenchers as a kid on my bike. You see in the left-hand corner, they're lighting a Molotov cocktail. I mean, these are actually taken out of the media. It's amazing the media can take these pictures and put them in their articles and then still refer to it as, well, there's a militarized response to a peaceful attempt. How many times did anybody hear the term tanks rolling down the streets of Ferguson? That's an M1A Abrams tank. This is a Bearcat, which is what was on the streets of Ferguson. Not quite the same. This is a Brinks armored car, which looks a heck of a lot more like a Bearcat than an M1 Abrams. But to this day, I still hear about military weaponry, militarized response, surplus military equipment being used on people in the city of Ferguson. And unfortunately, I've never seen this. I made this, of course, myself, but I thought, wow, if the media was really concerned about the truth, somebody could have easily said, I don't know, this really doesn't, these look probably closer together than a tank. But that's not the narrative that they wanted to continue to push. Unfortunately, Ferguson itself became the word. To see this hashtag there, it's important to note that because throughout the years when I would have to talk to people and they'd ask about Ferguson, I'd ask them, do you want to know about Ferguson or do you want to know about hashtag Ferguson? Hashtag Ferguson is like an event. The city of Ferguson are wonderful people and wonderful businesses and a community that wants to be safe, a community that wants to heal, a community that wants to come together and talk about things that might be difficult for some people to talk about, but as a community where people are not leaving, but people are wanting to stay and live with their neighbors, that community is different from what the media and activists have used to call Ferguson, which is their hashtag Ferguson. When we talk about hashtag Ferguson, we're really usually oftentimes talking about all of the sins that people talk about of the St. Louis region. You know, people oftentimes forget that Ferguson, the hashtag, the event, started just 4 days after Charlie Dooley lost a very, very racially charged Democratic primary. Can't blame this on the Republicans, right? A Democratic primary in which a white Democrat unseated an African-American county executive in a Democratic primary, and there was a lot of bitter blood. I can tell you that because I heard it firsthand on the streets while I was out talking to people and protesting, especially a lot of the African-American leaders who really were upset that their top dog, the highest-ranking African-American ever elected in the state of Missouri, was unseated and what I think today we can also say was somewhat unfair. If I could go back, I'd probably vote in a Democratic primary for Charlie over Steve Stenger, so sorry if you don't like that. You know, there's a lot of issues that St. Louis as a region, as a border state, we've always had. Over the years, there's a lot of redlining that have happened in this region, a lot of housing policies, and this is what happens when government overreach happens. This is what happens when government gets involved in places they shouldn't, in places that as free market people, as laissez-faire maybe Republicans, or laissez-faire kind of free market capitalists, or small government people, we should think about what the left, we're oftentimes blamed on the right for it, but really the left is done with this kind of housing policies and other policies, these social engineering policies that they've used, and throughout history they've really used it against African Americans. Segregationist housing and zoning policies, which led to decades that still exist of economic segregation and stratification of wealth along usually racial lines. North St. Louis County as a whole, which has become overwhelmingly African American, has happened long before Ferguson, but it is an issue that people who were demonstrating during the Ferguson unrest were very frustrated about. The aging infrastructure, the lack of attention to them. A lot of that had to do with the communities' their falling revenues. They didn't have the revenue to deal with the issues that were happening in North St. Louis County. Rising demand for public services. A lot of the lower income areas require more public services. They require more help, oftentimes, or at least they ask for more help. And then you see a lot of the small communities, and there was a lot of talk about reliance on traffic fines and forfeitures and seizures. Again, unfortunately, Ferguson being thrown with the yoke of a yoke around its neck, being called a community that lived off of traffic fines, yet year after year after year, Ferguson wasn't never, and still has never been, and even the top 50 percentile of communities in the St. Louis region that collect traffic tickets. But the narrative was really done not just by the media, but also by our federal government, because they made the decision early on. Did I do something wrong? Oh. They made the decision early on that Ferguson was going to take the blame. Not Pine Lawn, not Wellston, not Pagedale, not North County, not St. Louis City, not St. Louis as a region, which we all know again has had issues, but Ferguson, the city of, became the poster child, unfortunately, for dysfunctional government, racial strife, police brutality, etc. And I copied a few headlines because I think it's important that people realize how early on, without any kind of investigation by the federal government, without any kind of real investigation or anything, which came later, but we'll talk about, you had the media focusing on certain aspects of Ferguson city government. Slate.com, which is noticeably liberal, but their headline, Ferguson is mostly black, so why is its government so white? That was only 5 days after Michael Brown was killed. And by the way, this is just one of dozens of headlines like this. In Ferguson, a black town, white power. This was just a week after Michael Brown was killed. Heavy.com, which is not exactly the New York Times, but still interesting because if you follow social media, if you follow Facebook, if you see a lot of the things that's shared, this is one of the sentiments that was shared, and the headline was 5 things you need to know about the mayor of Ferguson. And it was interesting because of those 5 things, 3 of them were really stupid, but the first thing was you needed to know that he's a Republican, and the second one I think was that you needed to know that I was white, in case you couldn't tell that by seeing my picture. But for some reason that was important. Why is that important? I would tell you that I think it's a lot of it's important because, again, we saw the federal government come to the city of Ferguson, and they had an opportunity to socially engineer what they thought was wrong, not just in Ferguson, but in the United States, as it pertains to social justice issues, and especially as it pertains to how policing is done in America. We see that battle still continuing today, even with the federal government leadership having changed over. We still see a focus from the federal government about how communities and areas police and keep their communities safe. There was, just happened to be, the same time the events occurred in Ferguson, a study that was released from a task force of President Obama's administration on 21st century policing. And of course, they had many, many great, in their eyes, great ideas, progressive ideas about how we would and should police in America. Unfortunately, that's not how most people policed at that time, or even still today in America. And there are some side effects to the things they want us to do. So in the city of Ferguson, we were forced to not only just be the poster child, but then the guinea pig for the social experiment, which came down in the form of a consent decree from the federal government. And that consent decree forced the city of Ferguson, it was a negotiated process, but forced the city of Ferguson to adopt a certain amount of reforms and safeguards and other things that no other small community of 22,000 people in the United States does. Most, very few, could even afford to do. They sound great. Many of them are great in the sense that they do add, some of them, I would say, add a lot of benefit to the community. But again, I personally would think that I would have a lot of benefit if I had a Lamborghini, but I don't need a Lamborghini. I think that it does benefit to have, an independent, internal affairs division in every police department. I think that those are great things that we could think about having, but can you imagine the police department in the country having, a separate internal affairs division, which they don't want, by the way, to even answer to the chief of police. They have to answer to a separate board of unelected people appointed by the city council. That would be a civilian oversight board. I mean, these are all great things that sound good when some professor and a bunch of idealists are writing them on paper, but then how do you make that happen across the country? Every police department in the country should be accredited. That sounds good, but you know that only 6% of all police departments in the United States are accredited? Only 6%. And most of those are like St. Louis City, St. Louis County, New York, LAPD. You see other cities starting to do that. But Ferguson was raked over the coals because we didn't pay, thousands of dollars a year to some accrediting agency so we could put a sticker on our car. We were still accredited by the state's Board of Police Officers standards because that's what the law requires. But we didn't have to join any special groups to get little gold stickers and shields on our cars. And since we didn't have those, we were somehow pilloried about it. Well, all of this social engineering that was caused by the federal government had a lot of stress on their community. There was a lot of financial stress, and it really affected our tax and revenue base. Our city reserves were severely impacted by overtime, lawsuits, the use of legal counsel to defend against some of the federal government's accusations, and then, of course, the implementation of our consent decree. Forced us to have a little bit of an exodus on our staff. We had a lot of staff members who left. That caused a brain drain. It was very difficult for our community to continue to maintain both the public safety and the city services that our citizens expect and require of us while going through this. We were obviously short on staff. We had to rehire additional staff. Who wants to come to a community that's in the middle of a negotiation with the federal government? A negotiation, by the way, which we concluded in, I think it was 7 months. Now, Maricopa County took 6 years to sign their consent decree. And the federal government said if we didn't sign ours in 6 months, they'd sue us, and they did sue us. And then, unfortunately, some council members lost their spine, and we quickly capitulated. So, obviously, our public image has been seriously damaged, but here, locally and regionally, I think many people have seen many of the great things that have happened in our community, continue to happen in our community. That's helped locally at least fight back against it. But we still hear every time that something happens in the United States, Ferguson continues to be brought up as if it's a symbol. If people can't articulate what the issue or the problem is, they just say, well, I don't want it to be like Ferguson. Well, what's that like? Well, you know, like Ferguson. Okay. It's become a buzzword, a code word. It's one of those things that people say, they don't really know what it means, but they just know I don't want to be it. Of course, if you live there, we love being it. Federal oversight's been really difficult for us. Under the old administration, they really tried to micromanage our tiny little suburban PD, and that is a danger, not just to communities like Ferguson, but every community across the country should be concerned about our Washington, D.C. trying to micromanage what happens on the street in a tense situation in a community that they know nothing about. Oversight is expensive. We talk about wanting to be small government individuals. Well, they want to add more and more layers of government to continue to overlook you and then overlook itself and then somebody overlook it, because we can't trust the government, but we want more of it. That's the conundrum that liberals seem to continue to push upon us. You know, government's bad unless they're the ones in government, and of course, when they're in charge, then they want more of it. The expectations, frankly, are really unrealistic of what the old administration wanted from us, but we really pushed through. Most recently, you might have heard that the judge has continued, that oversees our consent decree, has said that we've made tremendous progress. But we also get less inflammatory words and no inflammatory rhetoric out of this current administration like we did the last one. Well, everything that we did right when Eric Holder or we usually dealt with Vanita Gupta, who is the head of the Civil Rights Division. Every time we did something good, we got a pat on the back and then a swat on the butt for something we were still not doing good enough. The new administration has been very helpful in helping us, but there are still things that are consequences left over from the efforts that the federal government under the previous administration did in the city of Ferguson. Most recently, there isn't a lot I will ever point to that I should say, hey, look, CNN said it, it must be right. But if you're a liberal, and you believe CNN, then I'll point to this. And you're probably not all liberals. I would assume none of you. There's a recent CNN profile of the community in August of 2017. Their head political correspondent, Thomas Lake, came and interviewed me and actually did quite a bit of interviews throughout Ferguson throughout the year and talked about how violent crime was astronomically higher in Ferguson than it had been. I don't want you to think it's not safe in Ferguson. Let me explain. Murders. We had 9 murders in 2016. We didn't have 9 murders in the 20 years before that. Thomas Lake said that, not just in Ferguson but around the country, is because police officers are depolicing. He talked about how people who feel they can do anything, and they pointed to something as simple as a traffic stop, that when you don't, and it goes back to the old broken windows theory. This goes back to how they cleaned up New York City, right? If you let things go, if people feel like they can drive through your community at 70 miles an hour with no insurance and no license plate, they don't have to register their car, they might have a gun in the car, they probably driving erratically. If you think that you allow that to go on, well, guess what? They're going to think they can do other things, and they continue to do other things. I would tell you that in all the years that we were very proactive in many of our policing efforts, every time we stopped a car with kids and a gun in it, they were probably on their way to do something they shouldn't do. And we're not stopping those cars anymore, and most places in St. Louis aren't stopping those cars anymore. So now they're getting from A to B, and when they get to B, they shoot somebody. Of the 9 murders in Ferguson, almost all of them were related somehow, and as far as somebody taking aggression out on someone and then taking retaliation back. You can connect many of the crimes in North St. Louis County, and actually all across St. Louis. Actually, some of these murders were committed by people from South County. And then they go down to South County and murder people. They come back. They can drive all over St. Louis with no plates on their cars, no insurance, guns in the car, suspended license plates, and nobody's stopping them. And they make it from Ferguson down to South County and back. And that's why you have the crime that you have. Now here's the thing. All these wonderful Victorian homes I told you about, all these wonderful businesses that we have, they're completely unaffected. Do you know who's being murdered? Young black men, the people that Eric Holder said that he was defending from the Ferguson Police Department. Who's the violent crime? I haven't been hurt. I mean, they did come out and break out my windows in 2015, but thanks to Window World, here's a shameless plug, they replaced them all. They have lifetime glass breakage. We called it an accident. All of them were broken by a rock thrown from my lawnmower. So you don't try that at home, by the way. This is what's been happening. The crime's not in our historic business district, where our new wine bar and our microbrewery and the street festival that's going on this weekend, which I would tell you when you're done here, after dinner tonight, come on over, hear some great music, and have some fun. It is some of the safest places you could be in St. Louis. But all you have to do is go on the other side of town where Michael Brown was killed, and it's not a cop or anybody else killing anybody. Well, there is somebody killing somebody, but it's not a cop. And unfortunately, the people who've spoken out don't want the police there. And instead, we have murders, we have violent crime, we have shootings, and lawlessness. It's a real issue that we have to deal with in our country, and I'm not sure that we're getting any better. Look what's going on today in St. Louis. A convicted drug dealer was just honored, the highest honor ever bestowed by the Board of Aldermen in St. Louis. He was given on Friday. He was a convicted drug dealer on probation, 2 weapons charges. Just look it up on CaseNet. It's there. Dozens of stories still misrepresenting the facts, and local leaders capitulating, honoring the man. I don't know that the police officer did everything right. Obviously not, because they lost a lawsuit. But I don't know under the law, and I trust a 30-year jurist to tell me that at least under the law, he did not commit first-degree murder. What situation are we in that we're out creating havoc in our community, continuing to spread misrepresentations of facts? I want you to take away from this the things that have triumphed in Ferguson, though. Throughout all the things I've told you about, we've stabilized our city budget while maintaining our city services. Moody's recently upgraded our credit rating, and our outlook is very positive. We've grown in our businesses. We have more businesses operating, and quality businesses operating in Ferguson today than we did in 2014. Our property values have gone up, the population has stayed, and the political leadership, that'd be me, we've overcome. We've had 3 municipal elections since that time. The slate of candidates from my administration have won in every election, and I just won this last time with 57% of the votes against a candidate who was extremely well funded from people all across the United States. She outraised me 3-1, and I spoke honestly and truthfully and was transparent to our residents, and they've continued to believe that that leadership is moving the community in the right direction. It's more than I can say for everywhere around St. Louis, unfortunately, but yeah. Monuments removal. You know why I'm still in office? Because I don't comment on monuments removal. If you're going down the road, don't try to avoid landmines that aren't in your path. Just keep on going. But I will say this, and I'd be very honest. I'm honest with my residents about it. Let's focus on those things that matter. Let's focus on those things that matter to people who are telling me they don't have economic security in their lives. Let's focus on those things that are making it difficult for kids to graduate high school, to get a job and create wealth for themselves and for the generations ahead. When we talk about the disparities that absolutely exist, I'm certainly not a denier. I've certainly been somebody who has proven in my community, especially in the African American community, that I want to see people in those parts of our community do better. Let's focus on what makes an actual measurable difference, and you'll see difference in your life. That stupid monument doesn't do anything to further that.
Don't you have a lot to be proud of in what's happening in more monuments added to those? 5 years have passed, and just Civil War, why not forward what you've done?
No, absolutely. I mean, you're right. I mean, I think people, again, they're focused on, a Civil War general who most people just think of it as a place where birds rest, and nobody goes to it as if it was a place where they're going to remember and celebrate racist parts in our history. I think everybody has different interpretations of what those monuments are, which I think is important. People need to recognize, but they got to move. But you're right; you've got to move forward from those. You're absolutely right. What would we? What would who brag about? Well, I'm 38, so. I mean, I'll tell you. I mean, a perfect example is when it's something I think is very important, and I touched on it briefly. The communities to the east and west and south of Ferguson are almost 90% African American. Ferguson is 67% African American. Now, that doesn't seem like an appreciable difference, but it shows you how many families have stayed and said, I want to embrace a diverse community and live in a diverse community. All those white families had plenty of money to leave, and they weren't that attached to their little houses in North County that they couldn't leave. What we've tried to do in Ferguson, what we've really done, and unfortunately was not celebrated, was we've been able to successfully integrate a community. There really isn't a white and black side of the community. There are better off sides of the community, but like I told Chris Hayes from Fox, or not Fox 2, not that Chris Hayes from MSNBC, I showed him around one of the nicest parts of our community, big Victorian homes, and he looks to me and said, well, Mayor, thank you for taking me to where the white people live. I said, well, you might want to knock on that guy's door because he's a black doctor, and he might take exception to that. And in fact, nobody, that community, even though they were huge Victorian homes, 100, 150-year-old homes, it was very diverse. I mean, at least 30, 40% of those homes were African-American-owned homes. That, I think, is really impressive that exists. It's not just, poor and black or this side or that side. It's really a diverse, integrated community. Any other questions? I think they're preparing. Yes, sir. It was 55. We were down at one point to 36. We're back up to about 42. Morale-wise, I mean, it's been difficult for a lot of people to who continued to be here before August 2014. Some people still have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder about when people hear that things are better now, or somehow we've wiped out the bad, because there was a lot of good people who left our department, and a lot of good people who were here beforehand. This past Thursday, I was at a neighborhood association. We have 13 neighborhood associations. I mean, high participation rates, especially among the African American community. I heard from a large number of them that night that kept talking about, what are we going to do? They were upset about some of the crime issues, and I understand. And they said, well, what can we do to fight back against, this rhetoric that's out there against Ferguson? I miss my police officer. I had good police officers before. Some of them I said, we should have said that 3 years ago. And some of them did. They were drowned out by the federal government and by people who didn't live inside of Ferguson. There is a group in the community that, the majority of the community really recognizes what they had before. The federal government did not accept the fact that in June of 2014, we had a survey done of our community, a citizen survey done by the University of Missouri St. Louis. It wasn't some silly survey. 25% of our respondents said the Ferguson Police Department was excellent. 50% of them said that they were good. And it was like 22% said they were fair, and it was 5% or less said that they were poor. Now, the University of Missouri St. Louis was paid to do a very professional poll, and this was a citizen engagement. They did not accept that. The Justice Department felt that, well, that's just old white people in the community. Well, here's the respondents. They're not old and they're not white, not even the majority. Well, but they're not the people who live in these housing these multifamily housing areas, these transient folks. Still tells you, I think, that there was a lot of people in the community beforehand that really had an affinity for what Ferguson was doing and doing right. Anybody else?
I think that was our last
All right,
question.
appreciate it. Thank you guys for the opportunity to come speak.